Well, without further ado, I am so delighted to welcome you back, Father Bradshaw, to this second session on early Christian conflicts, and we'll hand over the baton to you.
Thank you. We're going to start tonight with a document an early Christian document that I imagine very few, if any, know about among the folks gathered tonight. It's as old as the New Testament. It's thought to contain material that probably has its origin not much later than 20 years after Jesus' death, and was certainly finished by the end of the century. So it covers the period in which the New Testament books were being written. It's originally written in Greek. There only exists one copy, one manuscript of the whole work in the original Greek, though there are parts of it in other languages. And this single manuscript was found very late in the 19th century and had been lost since early times. And so it's changed very much our view of early Christianity. It seems to come from a Jewish Christian community, or primarily Jewish Christian community, as distinct from the Gentile Christians we were talking about last week. Its title is The Teaching of the 12 Apostles, which in Greek, the word teaching is didache, and so what's at the top of the page, which looks like didache, is pronounced didache, teaching of the 12 apostles. It's not, I hasten to add, actually written down by the original 12 apostles, but it's a tendency in early Christianity to give titles reflecting where they think the material comes from. And so it's really a twofold document. The first half is moral teaching. It's an ethical document, quite distinct from the second half, which is a set of rules. And I've taken just one part of that, which the editor of this particular edition has separated off from the rest to begin talking about tonight, because it tells us quite a lot about how the life of this particular community or group of communities was organized during the first century. And this section, as you can see, is concerned with apostles and prophets. But we find that the word apostle, when it's used in this document, isn't just talking about the original 12 disciples, but is using the term more broadly of people who went around attempting to teach about Christianity to the new Christian communities that they encountered on their journeying. And so mostly are the prophets. Again, here it's not about the Old Testament of prophets, it's about Christian prophets. There were Christian prophets. They're mentioned slightly in the New Testament, but they feature pretty prominently here. Just a word about prophets. We immediately think of fortune tellers, people who can foretell the future, but they're really inspired teachers. It's another word for inspired teachers. They may be able to say something about the future, but their primary work is to try to explain Christianity, to give the Christian message as they believe they've received it to those who listen to their teaching. So they're people who have or claim to have particular insights about the meaning of the Christian faith that they want to share with others. And they may engage in speaking with tongues, or other manifestations of the Spirit, but they're not primarily there to foretell the future. As I've said to students in the past, when your mother says, if you keep playing with that knife, you'll hurt yourself, she doesn't have a particular insight into the future that's been given to her. She just has a lot of understanding of little boys and knives and what happens. And the same is true about prophets. They don't necessarily have a roadmap to the future, but they do have or claim to have some insights into what will happen if people behave in particular ways. So much by way of introduction. Let's take a look now at this section. And it's clear that many of the communities that are addressed here are dependent upon these itinerant apostles and prophets for their Christian instruction. And these apostles and prophets travel and they stop and teach. But the question arises, how do we know they're genuine? How can we trust that this is reliable Christian preaching and teaching? And so this section attempts to address that question and offer some guidance as to how to do it. And as you'll see, if you've already started to read down the first paragraph, that the communities are instructed to receive every apostle as if they are the Lord, treat them with respect, but the apostle should not stay for more than a single day or 2 days if necessary. And if he remains for 3 days or more, then he's a false prophet. So here's one test is offered. If itinerants start to live off you and look reluctant to move on, suspect that they are not genuine. And similarly, if the apostle, when leaving, asks for money or other things except for food for the journey, then again, that's another sign that they're just in it for the money. On the other hand, the second paragraph tells us that we're not to test or judge any prophet who speaks in the Spirit. That's the speaking with tongues that I mentioned earlier. And the author of this section says that, of course, when you speak in the Spirit, you're not to criticize them and so on. On the other hand, not everyone who speaks in the Spirit is a prophet, but only he who follows the ways of the Lord. So it's behavior then that helps us distinguish a false prophet from a true one. So we've seen this, it's staying too long, it's asking for money, it's someone whose behavior doesn't fit his message. I'm using he here because by and large, these people seem to have been male. And similarly, it goes on in the next paragraph down that any prophet who orders a meal in the Spirit will not eat from it, but if he does eat of it, he's a false prophet. So when he's babbling away, speaking in tongues, and he asks for food, that's fine. But if he then eats it, he's clearly not in the Spirit, he's a false prophet. And again, the next line reinforces the point that false prophets will teach things, but not necessarily live up to them in their own behavior. So we're seeing some rough and ready rules here to help communities sort out true Christian teaching from false, but it's difficult for them to do. They don't possess the New Testament books yet, which might be a standard that they could test these people by. They don't know more than is taught to them. They don't have other sources of information. And so they're really at the mercy of the false prophets. And clearly they feared this was a problem, that people were taking advantage of Christianity, or at least had other interpretations of Christianity. We've seen how suspicious last week, how suspicious people were of Paul's teaching because it didn't fit in with what they'd learned so far. And similarly, the problem is much broader than that. The next paragraph, there's a great debate about what it means because we're not sure. So I'm going to skip over that short paragraph and go further on to the last line, where obviously people who say "give me money" don't listen to them. But if a prophet tells you to give to others who are in need, then that's a sign that he really isn't trying to profit in the other sense from it himself. The next section heading, these section headings have been added by the translator to make it easier for people to understand. Talks about generally visitors coming, which would include prophets and apostles, but again, you're to treat everyone who comes in the name of the Lord, receive them into the community and so on. If these people are only passing through, well, help them as much as you can. But again, 2 or 3 days is long enough for you to support them. They need to be moving on then, or supporting themselves. They may wish to settle, and they have a trade from which they can earn an income, then that's fine. Let them join your community. But if they don't have a trade, then you have to use your judgment about how they should live among you, but not in idleness. There was some concern among early Christians that with the end of the world coming, as they thought, very soon, there was no need for them to continue to work. They could just sit and wait for the Lord to come. And so again, there's a warning here about not letting them live off you. They're to look after themselves and support themselves as far as they're able. You don't expect them to stay permanently if they have no means of support. So we've got, I think, a pretty good picture here of the sort of situation, but we've also got a pretty good picture of the problems that this creates. How do you tell true from false? How do you know this is the genuine Christian message and not some wild interpretation of it that's not to be relied on? How do you know these people are truly preaching the gospel? And how far are they victims of their own delusion or deliberate charlatans? Let's go on. We've just heard that they're not to rely on you for food, and yet this section seems to think it's okay. Every true prophet who desires to settle among you is worthy of his food. Like a true teacher, like the worker, deserves his food. So there is this suggestion here that although you might be suspicious of a stranger and not let them live off you, if they settle and if you trust them, then they do deserve some support. And it uses some Old Testament material here to justify financial support for these Christian leaders, these charismatic Christian leaders. The Old Testament instructed that the first fruits of everything that resulted from the agriculture of the people of the Old Testament, the tribes wandering in the wilderness and then settling in Canaan, each year the first fruits of what they produced was to be offered to God. Whether it's, as you can see here, wine from the wine press, or grain from the harvest, or the first fruits of the livestock, the first animals to be born each year were to be given to the Lord. And the Old Testament has instructions for how that's to be done. So here it's suggesting that they continue the Old Testament traditions, but they give the first fruits to the prophets because they are your high priests. The prophets will be supported by the traditional first fruit offerings and live off those while they are working among the Christians. If there isn't a prophet, then the first fruits go to the poor. So a very pragmatic decision about what to do about the Old Testament injunctions. And we carry on now to the next page, where this is amplified a bit further. Making bread, take the first fruits and give it. Same when you open a jug of wine or oil, and so on. So although there are warnings against people living off you, there is an expectation that there will be some means of recompensing these charismatic ministers. I'm going to skip over the next section, which is headed here, the sacrifice, which is one of the very first mentions, actually, of Sunday as a Christian day and as a day of worship. And so many scholars think that section and the one that follows that we're going to look at are part of the later material added to these instructions. We don't think it was all, most people, scholars love to debate and rarely come to a conclusion that everyone agrees on. But the older material is here from the back in the middle of the first century, and perhaps this other material was added towards the end of the first century, because we don't have any explicit knowledge of Sunday being a Christian day until about 100 AD. Also, we under the heading Church Leaders, we have a reference for the first time to bishops and deacons. And it appears that the situation here is that the communities have begun to appoint church officials. And again, this is more likely to be official appointments towards the end of the first century rather than in the first flush of enthusiasm in the 20 years after Jesus. Two sorts of ministers are mentioned, bishops and deacons. Now, for bishops, both words are not ecclesiastical words. They are words in common use at the time. A bishop would be, if you like, an overseer. Or in my native Lancashire, foremen in factories were called overlookers, the supervisors. And so they're to appoint supervisors and servants. Deacons are those who serve. Obviously, quality matters, men who are meek, not lovers of money, honest and proven. But the next sentence is very interesting, for they also perform the service of the prophets and teachers. Therefore, do not hold them in contempt, for they are honorable men, along with the prophets and teachers. Now, this looks like a a significant transition period. And that's really why I've introduced all this tonight, to suggest that early Christianity was dependent upon self-appointed leaders, often perhaps the wealthy in a Christian community whose house would be used for meetings and worship, and so on, would be initial leaders, but also these itinerant or settled prophets and apostles, who would be the ones who would teach the community, who would preach the word, expound the gospel, and instruct in Christian morality. But that at some point, and we're not sure exactly when, but sometime in the late first century, Christians felt it necessary to have officials, particularly if they didn't have any resident prophets or teachers, but also because they would need somebody to do the administration and organization. And it looks like the bishops and deacons were church administrators to begin with, but who gradually assumed greater importance. So the bishop would become the equivalent of the rector of a parish, and deacons as the equivalent of assistant ministers. And they would take responsibility for organizing meetings, for distributing the gifts among the poor, and so on. So they'd be administrative officers to begin with, but increasingly they'd have to fill in where there were no prophets and teachers. And so do not hold them in contempt is not, may seem a bit surprising to us, but I think it's clear that the prophets and teachers were more likely to be recognized as authoritative because they seemed to have the gift of the word, eloquent preachers, knowledgeable teachers, and so they would be regarded with respect and listened to by a small church community. And we're talking of church communities no bigger than 30 or 40 people, because of fitting into even a large house for a meeting. And so naturally, they would get respect. But the bishop of the house church and the deacons would be folks who were well known to the other members. They would have jobs just like them. I know this happens in parishes today. If you've been away to a seminary and come back, you obviously get a lot more respect than if you're raised up within a church community, because you're no different from the rest of us. And I think the struggle is going on here to get these early Christian communities to regard with the same sort of respect the bishops and deacons than the rather more charismatic teachers whom they'd had before. So why the prophets and teachers begin to decline at this point, and the others, we don't know. It could be that there was a lot of suspicion that many of these prophets and teachers weren't as good as they appeared to be at first sight. But it's not the end of the influence of prophets and teachers. We know that at least down to the middle of the 2nd century, to about 150 or thereabouts, that Christian prophets were still listened to. they had influence. We know they had influence in the church in Rome as well as other places, and so the transition takes some time for these more mundane bishops and deacons to be recognized as equal in status to the prophets, and then in turn eventually as superior to prophets. There's a writer called Ignatius of Antioch, whom we're going to look at next week for a different purpose, who is a bishop and claims that he has the gift of prophecy that enables him to know that people should listen to bishops rather than to prophets. The circular argument, which is not very impressive, but you see the struggle they had in getting people to resist their natural appeal for the more dramatic, the more eloquent, and to settle for bishops and deacons. But that gradually happens so that by the end of the 2nd century, the authority of prophets has really disappeared. Not least because many of them were preaching things that the church in general had moved on from and didn't accept anymore. They were more likely, for instance, to be preaching that the end of the world was just around the corner, when by the end of the 2nd century, most Christians had decided it wasn't going to come in their lifetime. So a community led by a bishop with deacons, you could know that they were legitimately appointed because they were elected publicly, appointed by a Christian community, so that this overcame a lot of the problems of deciding whether foreign teachers had real authority and really knew the word of the Lord or not. So authority becomes transferred to these instituted church leaders rather than self-appointed ones. And so the difficulty of what's true and what's false is largely reduced. Of course, you couldn't guarantee that everybody who was appointed would be orthodox in their teaching, but it did help a long way. I'm going to pause before going on to a little more that I have to say, because I like to bring the clergy in here. You can talk back about this difference in status. Yes.
So, you know, the first thing that comes to mind is all of the Old Testament passages about how to know whether the prophet who presents presumably himself to you is a legitimate prophet, and the similarities, right? This needs to be someone who speaks the truth, looking to take advantage of, and so that tradition, the prophetic tradition of the Old Testament, is very much continued, at least here in this text.
Absolutely, but its weaknesses are also seen. Churches led by prophets are in danger of, on the one hand, of becoming cults, and on the other hand, of becoming drifting away, following their own interpretations. You know how. For the early church, true and false teachers was a difficulty. It wasn't obvious. We can look back and we can see who led people astray. But at the time, what's a true interpretation of the gospel? Who can say?
Certainly the time period that you're talking about here predates any time when those called bishops would gather together in conversation about these topics, right? So they're still relatively isolated, presumably?
Yes. It's by the late 2nd century, and that's what I'll talk about, the late 2nd century in a little while. By the late 2nd century, that's beginning to sort itself out. But certainly in the 1st century, time of the Didache, and even afterwards in the 2nd century, we still have that dilemma, and the competing authorities in a way. Is it the institutional leader or the apparently gifted prophet who we should listen to?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And, that's not an unmodern problem either. No, I mean,
one of the comments, I'm just checking up on the chat because I wasn't looking at it while we were screen sharing, and the modern day example of potentially the church run by prophets might be Bakers and Falwells, might be, I mean, we don't want to point fingers, but we
self-appointed
some
ministers,
uprisings in current times of churches that predominantly are prophetic type folks. Mm-hmm.
So it's one of the ways in which the institutional church that we're part of tried to deal with the problem. You could say that it ultimately suppressed the prophetic ministry, or rather, it absorbed it into the ministry of the bishop. I mean, it institutionalized it.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, that had its own dangers. But it didn't start out that way. It's a very simple idea to think that the 12 apostles started the church, as it were, and handed on the faith and so on in a highly organized manner. But it's more random and diverse than that. And that it's difficult to accept a simplistic view that Jesus taught the apostles what they had to say and they just went out and said it, and it was easy from then on. There were lots of people getting in on the act, and some apparently with dubious motives, and some probably very sincere, but possibly quite misguided in their idiosyncratic interpretation.
Mm-hmm.
So you did need some method of distinguishing true from false and of trying to preserve the true faith over against heretical movements.
Mm-hmm.
It's documents like this that help me imagine just the how much we take for granted the kind of calcified way that the church exists, and how little calcified. I mean, like there were just, everything was being created as they went along, and nothing existed. There was no infrastructure. There was no well-worn pathways of communication. There was no such thing as a New Testament. I mean, it's not just like, the sort of contemporary idea of like, well, I'm not going to go with institutional Christianity. I'm just, going to read the Bible and pray and meditate on my own. It's like, at this point, there was like nothing. And these communities really are just trying to figure out where to go for authority, where to go to hear the message that seemed authentic, and desperately hungry for it, and not really sure who to trust. It's so helpful. The plainness of documents like this just reminds me of how simple their needs were. It's like, who do I trust and who do I not trust? It's not like what vestments to wear on which day. And it was just, who can I trust?
Yeah. No, the vestment question comes later.
Much later, right?
We have many conflicts that I've tried to pick out early and more crucial ones, really, for the shaping of the church. I mean, last week I tried to look out that what role the Old Testament had, which is a continuing question for some people. Is it just the forerunner of the new, so you read it in the light of the new and you relate it to the new, or do you give it an authority of its own, which stands alongside the new. That's a continuing one, and this one too. You know, what's the authority of the institutional ministry over against charismatically inspired teachers? Because you know, although the church went with an institutional ministry as more reliable, not perfect, but more reliable in terms of a source of authority, sometimes that made it blind to the outsider who had an important message for the church in terms of the direction it was going. It's what we get at the 16th century Reformation, for instance, and so on. It's there still are, you know, issues there. Everybody still acts from mixed motives. They're still human beings, and that does become problematic.
There's a few questions out there from our attendees. Someone curious to know, is the Didache coming to us from a particular set of Christian communities that we know of? Do we know kind of, was there a cluster? You know how there's like a Johannine community,
Yeah.
etc. Is the Didache coming out of something like that, or do we have any knowledge?
Our knowledge is limited, and partly because we don't have much else. This has been so heavily studied in the little over 100 years since it came out that it's in danger of being overstudied. It's usually studied oddly, well, not perhaps oddly, by New Testament scholars who, having run out of bits of the New Testament to study, have co-opted the Didache and studied that as well. One of the reasons I'm not an New Testament scholar, you know. There's so little text to study and so many people doing it. It's a dog-eat-dog world out there. You know? Much better to do early Christianity, which is not so heavily populated with.
Remind us where
we can't be precise, and particularly because we only have this one manuscript. But obviously, the existence of translations of bits of it and so on are suggestive of wider influence, at least theoretical, whether anybody actually used it practically. And it's usually thought to be in the sort of Syria, Asia Minor area, probably more likely Syria than further west in Asia Minor. And it looks to be addressing more than one community, but I mean that may just be the hubris of the writer who was thinking he's going to influence very widely. It is so enigmatic because it left no trace. Nobody ever refers to it in early Christianity. You know, there are things we don't have from early Christianity, but at least we have reference to that they once existed. Mm-hmm. Whereas this was completely unknown until the 1880s when it was dug up. Don't ask me where it was dug up. That people always do, and I can never remember. So it's a lucky find, really, for an area that we know, an area of Christianity that we know very little about. The more Jewish, you know, untouched by Pauline teaching and so on. This is the Jewish Christian rather than Gentile world, it provides, you know, regulations for all sorts of things. I've only taken one major section because it fits the theme I wanted to look at, which is competing authority in determining the truth.
So a question for clarification: the deacons and bishops side by side in that one passage. Yeah. So did deacons and bishops have similar authority? How do we understand the sort of authority?
The communities, well, once bishops emerge, and the late first century is the earliest examples of it. Once it's one bishop, one community. As I say, they're the equivalent of the rector of a large parish. Well, not particularly large parish, small parish, but they're the sort of single rector figure, having started out more as a steward figure, organizing stuff. There's thought that some of the earliest ones may well have been slaves in a Christian household. So the owner of the household would appoint one of his slaves as the steward of the Christian community to organize things. And the role develops from organizing things to actually being the community leader. And we don't know how many deacons each bishop would have, but presumably several who are basically assistants. We don't yet have the equivalent of priests, but I'll, if there's time tonight, I'll pop that in.
Well, take us there. We've got,
Okay, yeah. Oh, I didn't know whether you had other questions. Yeah, I'll. In the writings of Ignatius of Antioch, whom I've mentioned a couple of times now, he has a bunch of letters, and it's clear that he also knows of an advisory group of lay people, the vestry, effectively, who are given the name presbyters, the Greek name for old men, and they probably were. That's how these will be senior lay people who would act as advisors and so on. They don't get mentioned here because presumably that sort of arrangement didn't exist in these communities. But by the 2nd century, the bishop has these elders as advisors to him. And by the late 2nd century, these have evolved more into assistant ministers. I'm not going to use the word priest for them because that's a whole linguistic issue, because the first ministers to be called priests were the bishops. By the 3rd century, we really are covering, the bishops began to be thought of in, using Old Testament language, as priests or high priests of the Christian communities. And so the Greek and Latin word for priest was used for them. The problem with the English language is that the word priest in the English language is a contraction of presbyter. So for presbyter to come to be called priest was simply a contraction of the word presbyter. But to mean priest, the primary priest was the bishop. He would be described in priestly terms. But to try and clarify, by the late 2nd century, therefore, we now have a structure of a threefold ministry of the bishop, whose responsibility extends beyond a single house church or even a single city to the land around it, with presbyters now being needed not simply to act as advisors and so on, but to deputize, to take services and perform baptisms and so on. And the bishop also continues to have deacons to assist in a more practical capacity. And it's in the writings of a bishop called Irenaeus, who's a bishop in France, Gaul as it was then known, who comes up with the idea that of apostolic succession, a way of being more certain who the true teachers of the church are. And basically he argues that there's been a succession of bishops. Each bishop is followed by another bishop who takes over his place and so on through time, so that the apostolic faith is passed on from bishop to bishop in the ancient parts of the world where Christianity first originated, the cities of the ancient world. And so collectively, they provide a means of being more certain of the truth of the gospel as it's proclaimed to us, because it has been transmitted and handed down from the bishops of the ancient diocese down to whatever the present day is. And so Irenaeus argues that that's what gives authority, is the knowledge that these are duly appointed people. They're not self-appointed. They don't come up, arise from nowhere. They are appointed by their local communities. Bishops are still elected at this point by their local community to replace the previous bishop and presumably to teach in line with the previous bishop. And they would know if the bishop deviated. So it's not 100% maybe, but Irenaeus's theory of apostolic succession provides something to hold on to that is more secure than simply a powerful preacher or who captures our imagination. Just to clarify, the doctrine of apostolic succession later in the church, in the Middle Ages, comes to be seen differently in terms of passing on powers of the apostles from one bishop to the next. A sort of pipeline, often described as the pipeline theory of transmission, that the apostolic grace and powers are communicated from one bishop to the next at ordination by the hands that are laid on them. Through those hands goes the powers and grace to the next bishop, and so on. It's a theory of hands on heads transmission, which I think has really lost the point, because what it was about was a succession in teaching. The bishop sits and teaches the people, and his successor occupies his seat and continues to teach. And so it's a transmission of teaching, whereas the later medieval theory made it the mystical powers that only bishops possess being passed on. As one liturgy professor once said, it's more a matter of bottoms on seats than hands on heads in the early church. If you sit in the seat of the apostle, as it were, you teach the faith of the apostle. And so it's more a succession in doctrine that gives us that greater sense of security. Of course, none of these are infallible. As Episcopalians, we don't believe in infallibility of any sort, I think. But you can see how the evolution of these ways of thinking help the church get around the problem of how do we know what the true gospel is. The scriptures provide it, but who is to interpret the scriptures, and the provision of a succession of bishops, not any individual bishop, a succession of bishops, provided that institutional framework for apostolic teaching to continue and develop. Whereas the anonymous documents like the Didache and so on, we don't know who wrote it, we don't know what authority it had. It gives us an insight, but you need rather more than that. And it's one of those things that means that founding your own church usually doesn't work very well, because it relies on you getting it right all the time.
Friends out there, any questions thus far?
is silent. They may be drinking from a fire hose right now. But that's good. This is it's all helpful to understand how it is that we came to be who we are today.
If I could put in a little advertisement for next week, we've been looking at, if you like, the instruments of doctrine in terms of what do we make of the Old Testament versus the New? How do we know true teaching? What's the role of the ordained ministry in relation to that? Those sorts of what you might call second level questions. I want to move on to some more, couple of more primary things in the next 2 weeks. And in particular, to look next week at the conflicts in early Christianity about who was Jesus, and in particular, the questions of was he human or divine? So something nearer the heart of gospel questions.
Yeah, which just comes back to these first few decades as these prophets are wandering around, landing in different villages, and people don't know who to believe. I mean, I wonder how they wrestled with the question of Jesus's identity. I mean, it's especially thinking that this may have been written for a largely Jewish Christian audience, and
yeah.
I mean that it's so easy again in the 21st century to have so deeply sort of absorbed all of these settled answers that it is easy to forget how deeply unsettled all of this was and how monumentally confusing it must have been to know how to even make sense of it.
Yeah, well, this in particular, I think in the second century church, when we've gone quite a long way from roots and into a more Gentile world and more influence of Paul and less of, I mean, there's still some struggles in the second century about, the place of the Old Testament and Jewish laws and so on. But you also have this wide range of teachers in various places, perhaps doing their best to interpret and understand it. But who do you refer to? There isn't a good, useful reference book. The scriptures are only just beginning to be recognized as authoritative, and you still have questions about which books are in and which books aren't. So you really don't have, I mean, the complete composition of the New Testament canon, although it begins to be formed by the end of the second century into the third, you don't have a universal agreement on what's in and what's out till the beginning of the fourth century, when we first get our lists of books that are agreed. And so you have people who listen to different scriptures to begin with, and they interpret them differently. I mentioned last week about the Gnostics who claim they're the ones with the true knowledge, and you need to join us in order that we can give you the true and secret knowledge that nobody else has. And some very fanciful interpretations of God and Jesus, which we'll touch on a bit next week. So it is a confusing time to be a Christian, and although our histories tend to be written from the point of view of the winners, if you dig around, there are traces of the people who thought otherwise among various writings of these first 2 centuries that show us that it wasn't all settled easily, and the answers weren't all obvious, except for the people who deliberately were being obtuse. People really didn't know how to interpret what they had, and varieties of interpretations flourished, and they still do.
An interesting question just been popped up in the comments or in the chat. Peter is referred to as the first bishop of Rome.
Yes.
So what does that mean in the time in which he was exerting his apostolic leadership? Like what does being bishop of Rome even mean? particularly as it relates to some of the stuff you've been talking about. Bishops and deacons were not what we know bishops and deacons to be now.
That's a very good question. Perhaps a bit big for the last few minutes, but
You have 2 minutes.
I'll try to tackle it. This is tradition looking backwards and imagining Peter in a role that really didn't exist. Remember, Rome would have consisted of, we know there were Christians at Rome. Indeed, there's a letter from the church at Rome to the church at Corinth, written by someone called Clement, who again is usually regarded as part of the line of bishops of Rome, but he appears to have been the secretary, of the Roman church leaders. But because it's a large city, there are lots of house churches. There is no the Bishop of Rome, partly because at that stage bishops were, insofar as they existed at all, and not every church had adopted the notion that community leaders were to be bishops until much later. And so it's tradition that has projected that back. And it's hard really to produce very firm evidence that Peter was actually at Rome and so on. It's easier to see that Paul went to Rome because the Acts says so. But Peter's connection with Rome is a bit more difficult from a historical point of view. But tradition has produced this line of bishops of Rome, starting with Peter, when in fact there probably was no single bishop of Rome until well through the 2nd century, certainly the middle of the 2nd century. There's evidence that there wasn't a bishop of Rome as such then. Much of what,
and it would have been many centuries, right, before the Bishop of Rome becomes a sort of central figure in the church. I mean, there were other episcopal leaders or bishop leaders or just ecclesiastical leaders who were every bit as significant to the sort of influence. As, I mean, we understand the Bishop of Rome today or the Pope today to be like the person, but that wasn't necessarily.
No, if we go back to Irenaeus, whom I was talking about, Irenaeus recognizes Rome among the churches that he believes go back to early times and were founded originally. But all the other churches of equal standing are in the East, obviously, because Christianity came from East to West. So in the Eastern Mediterranean places, like Jerusalem, of course, like Alexandria, like Antioch, so on. So it's what appear to be the ancient churches founded in the 1st century, and so Rome is one of those. It's the only Western one, so that gives it a certain cachet. But and by then, by the time Irenaeus is writing, the 180s or whatever, there were figures who were recognized as the Bishop of Rome. But they seem to have struggled a bit with authority because the authority seems a lot more dispersed in Rome. So the bishop probably wasn't as powerful as we imagine. And certainly in the mid-3rd century, you've got Cyprian, who's the Bishop of Carthage in North Africa, who's prepared to have quite a public disagreement, shall we say, with Rome about what you do about people who abandon the church and come back and so on. So it's only over time that Rome exerts authority in the Western church, the Latin-speaking church, over other bishops. It's again longish process, and that happens because its antiquity is accepted and respected. The stories of Peter and so on help to to give the sense that we can ask Rome what the truth is when we're uncertain, because it's been there a long time.
Yeah. Wow. I think we're near our time.
I think so.
We have some questions that perhaps we can try to come back to in future weeks. Question about the presence and role of women in this early church and what we know about their ability to serve in positions of leadership or significance. And then
perhaps say something briefly, because I've been very conscious of not saying that and using male pronouns, because basically from the end of the 1st century onwards, all the offices of any importance do seem to have been held by men. The exception is a movement called Montanism, which erupts towards the end of the 2nd century, and which is really just old-fashioned Christians. I mean, it's treated, it's an interesting example where the so-called Orthodox are the people who've often gone off at a tangent, and the people who've stuck to the old ways get labeled heretics and so on. And Montanus has a church which thinks the end of the world's coming quite soon, has a church that has prophets still and women prophets. And so it looks like a throwback to an earlier generation, which is what I think it is. But of course, the church has already moved on. So I'm afraid women get squeezed out of any position of importance very early. When we start asking about the 1st century, then there are more possibilities, fewer certainties, but more possibilities. It's very likely that if women were heads of some households, as often they were, through the death of their husband or whatever, they would likely have led the church, because and certainly the practice of women living together in a household and making a little community is there in the 4th century and so on. So they exercised some sorts of leadership in an unofficial way later on. But in terms, were there women prophets in the 1st century? Philip's daughters are mentioned in Acts, I think, as doing that. So there are little traces that suggest there was more of it, but it's just got, as with so much history of women, just lost to time when later practices overtook. So it's maybe for the 1st century, or in some places for the 1st century, but only unofficially thereafter.
Thank you.
Sorry about that. Otherwise, we could have had a whole session on it. But just not enough knowledge of the disagreements there to know. They didn't write it down, so we don't know.
Yeah. Thank you. Well, would you do us the honor of closing us in prayer this evening?
Yes,
please?
certainly. Almighty Father, whose blessed Son before his passion prayed for his disciples that they might be one as you and he are one. Grant that your church, being bound together in love and obedience to you, may be united in one body by the one Spirit, that the world may believe in him whom you have sent, your Son, Jesus Christ, our Lord.
Amen.
Amen.
Thank you so much. It's been a wonderful evening, very, very rich, and we look forward to gathering with you again next week on Wednesday.
Awesome, everybody. Thank you so much. Good questions tonight. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you soon.
Good night, friends.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.